I've been preparing for this. I'm nervous. I don't get nervous. I've been preparing for this. And last night my roommates saw me preparing and they said, "We thought you didn't prepare for podcasts." And I said, "Well, not my own, but for Kat." Well, yeah.
You're hilarious. I'm Kat Armstrong, and you're listening to Holy Curiosity, a podcast highlighting the genius storytelling of God from the Old Testament to the New. Each week, we'll explore storied connections threaded throughout Scripture. My hope is that these stories will spark a holy curiosity in your own faith, because once you see these connections, you can't unsee them. God wastes no person, place, or thing. Nika Spaulding joins Holy Curiosity today, and I'm thrilled because Nika is a dear friend. We have a little too much fun in this episode talking about Deborah as the second Moses in Scripture. Nika grew up a jock, but sometime after the skin knees and plastic trophies, she realized she was just actually a Bible nerd. She spends her days studying and writing about the Bible and theology, but the nights, she still pretends to be a jock on the pickleball courts. The greatest loves of her life are her nieces and nephew, and after them, her love includes Corey, the German Shepherd, Oklahoma softball, and LeBron James. She believes in her bones that God loves you. Nika has a master's from Dallas Seminary. She's almost finished with her doctorate in ministry and New Testament. She writes for the Bible Project, and she has a wealth of theology resources on her website. Go check it out, nikaspaulding.com. Here's my conversation with the one and only Nika Spaulding. Today, we're talking about Deborah is the second Moses. We've been building towards this moment. We've talked about Moses being a judge. I've talked to Dr. Michelle Knight about all the judges in the Old Testament, the role of a judge. We've zeroed in on Moses. We've zeroed in a little bit of Deborah with Dr. Gupta. And now I want to help listeners put it together, that Deborah is a second Moses. The first question for you is, what has been your most Deborah-like moment in life?
So I was down like 10-6 in pickleball the other. I'm just kidding. I
had bets on how long
I'd make it
until you talk about pickleball.
It is a cult, and if you don't talk about it, you don't get to play it. So my actual Deborah moment is about 6 years ago. I got asked by a guy named Martin Bond to plant a church in Oak Cliff, which is the best part of Dallas. With no shame, I can say that with confidence. And what's interesting about that is like, I, as a woman through seminary, never saw myself as a church planter because not that there weren't women who were planting churches, but in these urban contexts, I couldn't point to a woman. They were out there, but just not in the spheres that I was in. And so, sort of this man and woman teaming up to go do what we felt like God was calling us to do. There were gifts and moments that required courage, moments that required leadership, moments that required humility that the Lord was so faithful to take Martin and I through. And so when you get to you get to Judges 5, and we'll talk more about this, but my favorite part of the whole poem is when it says Barak and Deborah sang together. And I think that so much of the last 6 years at St. Jude Oak Cliff has been that, my tone deaf self singing with Mart together in songs of what God has done. Because of his goodness and his mercy and his conquering and all of that. Because that's the other thing is like you see these like conquests and it's like, well, they didn't do much. But, you get to sing and be excited about what God's doing. And so I look at Deborah's story and like, if I had to pick a Bible character that I would say, man, this is the person that, really I'm drawn to. The two people that always seem to rise to the top are Joshua and Deborah. And so like when you were talking about this podcast, I was like, I love Deb. Like, I can't wait to talk about this as Deborah is the new Moses, because I feel a kindred spirit to her in the sense that much of her leadership, I have not led an army into battle. Like, I don't want to blow this out of proportion, but to be a female leader in the ministry context that I'm in, I often think about, how Deborah led in those moments, led so beautifully. The scripture speaks so highly of her. And that's a model for me to want to run after.
And why are you the right person to have this conversation with me today? Do you remember what I texted you when I tried to recruit you for this episode?
I don't want to bring it up because it's part of my nerves. I don't even want to. You know what, Kat? Do you want to tell the listener what you told me? Because I was like,
I want you to tell them.
I got this text from my good friend, Kat. Kat and I are real friends. Sometimes you listen to a podcast and you think like, oh, these people are chummy. but that's because people are winsome. Kat's very winsome. We are real life buddies. And she says to me, hey, Nika, I want you to come to a podcast about how Deborah's the new Moses. Here's the thing, though. You are my second choice, which is fine. Like Kat has, like I would happily be Kat's 10th choice on most things, but I'm like, cool. Who? Just for the sake of curiosity, who was number one? And she said, oh, Richard Bauckham. Oh, cool. Yeah.
Nika's on
it's not like I read the giant tome of gospel women to get most of this information that I have here. It's not like I'm, filling in shoes of a theological giant. But you know what? I'm not offended by that. To be Richard Bauckham's second might be the new profile, like highlight of my. I don't have a LinkedIn, but if I did, I would say one time after Richard Bauckham, I was asked to be on Kat Armstrong's podcast, and that would be enough to get me many jobs, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful that you said yes, Nika. I really am. And I love that you kind of got nervous about the show. I did too. And I think part of it is that you and I both feel an affinity to this female character in the scriptures. We want to do right by her. I want to talk about all the ways that Deborah and Moses are similar. I've listed 5. If you thought of more, bring them up. But the first one I want to talk about is that both Deborah and Moses faced oppressive rulers. So tell us about who Moses faced. Tell us about who Deborah was fighting. What were they doing?
Yeah, love it. And actually, before we even jump in, when you said this kind of a new thing, I was so pleased during my research to find out that medieval rabbis actually paired the weekly Torah reading of these two stories together. Huh. And so I was like, man, if that's not a confident boost, because I am not in the habit of disagreeing with medieval rabbis. Like, I just don't make a habit of that. And so
we're not going to pick a fight with them.
Yeah. So all I had to say, I think for this holy curiosity, this thing that you're doing, these parallels, I hope will be convincing people by the end and encouraging them to go back and look at the story. Let's take Moses first, right? You've got this incredible story of the Israelites down in Egypt. And there's this Pharaoh, this like very daunting, a Pharaoh rises up that did not remember Joseph, did not know Joseph. And then you see that he starts to see the Egyptians are increasing in number. And unfortunately, throughout history, when you see a minority group increase in number, increase in ability, often fear from the majority becomes then oppressive. And that's exactly what we see of this Pharaoh. We see him not only have this like genocidal maniac moment of like wanting to kill all these Israelite boys, but you have this brutal enslavement to try and reduce the number of the Israelites. And of course, because they're God's people, scripture's like he keeps going, but there's a harshness to the Exodus story as you started. And that contrasted harshness with later the Exodus, like this freeing is like this really profound story. But I think we get so comfortable, like Pharaoh, like we move too quickly. And I'm like, no, this was a really bad dude who wanted to really harm out of fear of what's happening. And so then you fast forward to Deborah's story. And King Ehud is like gone, right? And it's like sort of these cycles and judges. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, and then the Israelites, they were doing, Israelite things again, and
doing
so King Jabin, they do what they do, humaning again. And so right after we have this new cycle, and so through the rebellion, and King Jabin of the Canaanites, it talks about how he's like really oppressing them for 20 years. I'm 40, basically. Like, I can't imagine half of my life under this oppressive ruler. And so you've got King Jabin, and then you have his right-hand guy, Sisera, who is going to be the army. And I think it's important to name him too, because in the poem, him and his mom feature pretty heavily in Judges 5. Both of these oppressive rulers, it goes to great lengths to talk about just how much might they have, right? Not only are they oppressing the Israelites, like you've got chariots in common. So the Pharaoh talks about he has 600 chariots, like the best chariots, and then more. Sisera brings out 900 chariots. And y'all, you're talking about in the Exodus story, like an enslaved people. Do you need chariots to beat up an enslaved people that you've already oppressed? And then you've got Sisera, and he's fighting really a half of an Israeli army. It's not as many as the whole, it doesn't talk about all 12 tribes come together in unity, and 900 chariots. Like, you're supposed to kind of look at that and be like, they're going to get stomped.
Yeah. You do not have the literal manpower to overcome these iron chariots.
Yeah. So I want to highlight Sisera and Pharaoh. Both of them underestimate women, which is really fascinating. You've got Pharaoh, and he's like, hey, kill all the women. And Shiphrah and Puah. Man, I love Shiphrah and Puah. If I had another pet, I don't have any children, which is why I'm saying this. Like, I love them so much. So
your pet is going to be a midwife's names. I love it.
Yes, I love them. And so he's like, hey, make sure you kill all the boys. And they defy him. And they say no. And they come back and they're like, hey, those Israelite women, they're just different, right? And he underestimates women, but it's women who refused to kill Moses. It's a woman who puts Moses in the Nile. It's a woman in the Egyptian court who plucks him out. It's a woman who watches it happen, young girl, woman. And so you have this like underestimating of women and their ability to continue to do right. And then you have Sisera, who underestimates women. You got his mom singing this horrible song at the end of the poem. And it's two women who bring about his downfall, including Jael, who I'm like, you really thought you could just go nap in her tent, bro. Like you did not understand who you were messing with. And so I think that's also interesting in this story is like, you have this contrast of Deborah, who's really beautifully strong, and these really maniacal men who misunderstand just how powerful and strong women can be. And both of them ultimately see the downfall of their empire through these women.
So I think by the time we get to Deborah's story, we should feel as though the editors of scripture, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, intentionally included some of these details and put them at the top of these stories so that we would go, oh, wait a minute. When's the last time we had an oppressive ruler? That's a familiar storyline. That's a familiar setting for a story. Wait, we have a male maniacal leader who's trying to kill a lot of people that they already oppress and stomp them out, quite literally, under their iron fist or their iron chariots. This sounds familiar. We need a leader to rise up. We need a leader full of character and courage, who will go against the orders or the norms of the day. And so we should already start to feel, oh, wait, yes, Deborah feels familiar. She reminds me of Moses. And that leads us to the second thing that they have in common, which is they were both judges for their people. And I had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Knight from Trinity Evangelical Seminary about her doctoral work and all of her commentary work on the Judges, the book of Judges, and specifically Deborah. But man, we had an interesting conversation about their role. So tell me a little bit, Nika, about Moses and Deborah both being judges and what the scriptures have to say about their judgeships.
Yeah, that's so good. So it's interesting. Like so Moses is kind of has this like big moment of judging. It's funny. I say like Moses had his tent and Deborah had her tree, right? So you're going to see these two places. They sort of have these places that the people know that they can come and receive counsel from them. And so Moses, especially see it in like Exodus 18, that he's judging so much. Like it says like from morning to night, all of Israel's coming to him and they're like, we need you to decide, so much so that his father-in-law Jethro's like, hey, this is not sustainable. Like you need to set up a judicial system. But what you see in both of them, what's really interesting is you see them doing the work of judging, right? Making decisions on behalf of the Israelite people. And the reason why I say that is when you fast forward to Deborah, the whole book is called Judges, but she's the only one you ever see judging. Like you see Gideon and Samson and all these other judges doing things, but you don't ever get any literary like echoes of them like sitting at a tree and making decisions on behalf of the people, which is why it's fascinating that the same Hebrew word used of Moses, shaphat, to talk about him judging, is the same word used of Deborah in Judges 4:4-5, but a lot of translations just say lead. She was leading the people. And so I think that's one of those echoes that depending on the translation you can miss, where Moses, you think of him as a judge. You think of this like, yeah, he was coming and deciding cases. And I'm like, that's what the author is saying to us in that book of Judges as well. And in not saying it about Gideon, not saying it about Samson and these other guys. And so I think that's like one of the more fascinating things. And I'll tell you another one of I think another wink that the author of Judges gives us is at the beginning of Judges 1, it talks about Moses judging. And it talks about his father-in-law, Jethro. And in the Exodus account, it says he's from Midian. But in the Judges account, it calls him a Kenite, which is where Jael is from. Like she's married to Heber the Kenite. And so all of a sudden you're kind of like, wait, there just seems to be like Kenites in both of these stories, which I don't know about you, but I haven't looked in a while. I don't think there's a ton of Kenites in the Bible. So, there is this sense of, wait, there's a lot of parallels happening here that I think sometimes in our translations we miss. Because we say, oh, Deborah's just a leader. She's not judging. And I'm like, no, I think that's what they're saying literally is we're meant to see her doing the very role that we saw Moses doing after the Exodus out of his tent.
And just the sheer quantity of what Moses was filtering through and deciding on should make a lasting impression on a reader. There was so much of it. And then by the time you get to the book of Judges and you get to Deborah's story and you see the multiple judges that come before her who are not mentioned doing any actual judging. They're doing other parts of the judgeship as deliverers and other type things. she should be a standout. And all of a sudden we should go, wait a minute, who else was being approached all the time? Moses was. Again, we see Moses and Deborah are connected, not just through the oppressive rulers that they faced, but also in the roles that they played in their stories. What is so easy to see is they were both effective. They were both effective at what they were doing. And Moses deputized. And it was strange what happens with Jael in that story, because she doesn't get deputized to be a judge, but she comes alongside Deborah to complete the job that Barak and Deborah set out to do. And that kind of leads me to the third thing that they have in common. Both Deborah and Moses witnessed cosmic water movement to defeat their enemies. I want to talk a little bit about this, Nika. Just cosmic water movements in general are all over the scriptures, but these two prophet judges both witnessed God do that.
I think that would be one that, like, if somebody listened to your podcast and was like, I want to do what Kat just did, I would say, go look for cosmic water. Like, you'll find it in the Psalms. You don't have to get out of Exodus. Genesis, you'll find it. And so I think most people who have any sort of familiarity with the Exodus story at all kind of know about this Red Sea, right? The way Hollywood has portrayed it over the years, like, amazing, right? I'm like, bigger, and I don't know if it should be bigger, but I'm like, take the liberty as an artist and make it bigger. Basically, God tells the Israelites, like, you're going to walk out of here. And the craziest part of that whole story to me is when they go to their Egyptian neighbors, like, hey, can we have all your gold? God told us to take your gold. And they're like, oh yeah, hey man, sorry about that oppressive behavior before it like slides off the ring. I'm like, I don't know how that went down, but I'd love to have a camera shot of that. And I'm going to be asking people in the new heavens, new earth, like, what was that like when you asked your neighbor for that? But
when your neighbor pulled out their oppressive receipts and said, I will take my due now before I leave.
Hey, Bill, remember me? Yeah. So gonna need your wife's necklace, her nose ring, and all those bracelets. Thanks, man. But don't tell anyone. I'm probably gonna make a golden calf later, but let's just see what happens. If you look at a globe, right? You look at a map and you see Egypt to the promised land, right? Where we're headed. We're going to have a lot of geography to go through. And there is this water crossing out of Egypt across, whether it's the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. And I know there's a lot of commentary on that, but there's water. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the point. And in the ancient world, they didn't just have like motorboats, ferries, all that stuff. I think people think of battle imagery and they think like this equally matched Israeli army with like Egypt, and there's this battle. And I'm like, consistently when you watch battles in the Bible, overwhelmingly, you just see God doing things that they could never do. So Moses parts the Red Sea. It says they walked across on dry land. And let me just tell you, as a sneakerhead, I did not miss that detail because I don't like walking on mud because I'm not traipsing through mud in my new sandals. I just stole from Bill on my way out. So they get across the Red Sea and then they turn around. And what's really incredible is in both of these accounts, and we'll talk about the Deborah one, the Israelite army got to watch their enemy be vanquished. And I think like there's such a parallel for us in that and the cross as well. Like I think there's something really beautiful about that. But it says he sends them into a panic and then the water comes back over and they're taken out. And that event, I think so many people are like, yeah, I know that event. The Deborah one, if some of you have read your Bibles and you, like me, when you were younger, used to skip the poetry and the genealogy, you might be wondering what water event we're talking about. In order to see the water rescue, you have to look at the poem in Judges 5. If you do, the poem beautifully offers us some details that we don't have from Judges 4. In those details, the Kishon River, it says it fills up with water. So that they're in a wadi, which is like a dry riverbed, and chariots don't float. So, they're in that dry riverbed. And then it says that the rains came in and it says that they basically are taken out by this water. And which is like the irony of that is like you have this like iron chariot. I'm like, well, it doesn't work when it's underwater, does it, buddy? Right. And so you see this unbelievable, massive rescue with water. Where we see this, this cosmic. And one of the things I want to point out, because again, your reader should be picking up echoes, right? I mean, as you're kind of going through the Bible, there are two phrases that are used in both of these events. One of them, in both the Exodus and the Judges account, it says that God threw them into a panic. That exact phrase is used. And then it says not one remained.
That's right.
So it's not like a bunch of Sisera's army disappeared and they're hiding out, right? Or it's not like the Egyptians, right? Like and again, war rhetoric and war actuality are not the same. So I don't want to say that. But what I'm saying is it's interesting that both of those passages have both of those phrases within them. And you're meant to go, wait a minute, when else have I heard God threw them into a panic? And when else have I heard not one remained? And when else were chariots taken out by water, then suddenly you're like, oh my goodness, is this not the same story? Like it's eerily similar to each other, if not for an author intending to do this very thing.
Yeah. And that God so intentionally decided, I'm going to repeat this a second time to emphasize there is no amount of strength that I can't overcome. There is no amount of a battle or a warlord or an evil oppressive ruler that I can't overthrow or throw into confusion. I love that part of what God is doing, just displaying his character in both stories and through both of these characters. And these water experiences, that could be something for listeners. They could just do a deep dive. They could look up the word water and just study it all the way through Genesis to Revelation, if Bible Project hasn't already done that.
Hey, Tim. Hey, John. Just throwing out ideas. Hire Kat so I can be her fangirl.
The fourth thing that we talked about was that Deborah and Moses both experienced victories in battles that were fought in valleys. So you use the word wadi. That shows up in lots of translations, sometimes even the CSB. It can also be translated valley. And this may not be like a deep cavern, but it's a place where the water would accumulate. And I did a whole Bible study, wrote a whole Bible study called Valleys. And this is where I put those two stories together. So tell us a little bit about the places where they're fighting these battles and a little bit about the valleys in general.
You go back to these cosmic water events, you go back to where they're located. So you've got the Valley of the Red Sea there. And I thought you did such a beautiful job with that. You've got the Valley of the Red Sea and then that wadi word, which it's like a cool geography word if you want to like razzle dazzle people. But it is like a valley. It's like a valley of the riverbed. It's interesting because you think of valleys as like, we say valleys and mountaintops, right? We say sort of like, and in a lot of ways, those valleys are legitimate. You're facing a superior army. Like that would be a valley for me. I don't want to fight somebody who's got all these chariots and all that. And it's in those valleys that ironically they experience these mountaintop moments. Yep. And so for Moses, it's that Valley of the Red Sea. I just can't imagine the feeling that the Israelites have had where you talk about seeing the character of God, right? You have been oppressed wrongfully for no other reason other than you're an Israelite. You have been oppressed by people you can see face to face. I mean, that's a different kind of oppression in that slavery and in that enslavement. You've been oppressed for a long, long time. And you get across that riverbed and it's miraculous, but you can hear the chariots coming. When they're like, why did you bring us out here? Is it because there were no grave sites back there? Like it would have been better for us there. And you think about that impending death at the hands of an angry army versus enslavement in a life that we already know. Sure, actually, I can empathize with that. So the feeling that they must have felt when they watched their enemy vanquished before them and all that justice that God is rightfully bringing to those people. And then you fast forward and Deborah looks at Barak and that like rally cry, like, today the Lord has told you, like, let's go. And Barak outmanned, outsized, out everything with unbelievable courage to trust the voice of God through this woman, to watch God. You're watching chariots in a wadi, in this valley. And all of a sudden you're like, man, God did that. And we're no longer under the oppressive rule of King Jabin.
Yeah.
Like we're free.
Yeah.
And I just think that freedom is like, for Christ came to set us free, right? This freedom in our gospel, there's freedom in God. And these very tangible, beautiful pictures of sometimes the valleys are actually the places where God's going to bring freedom. That's right. I don't want to lose sight of that.
That's right. In the Bible study that I wrote, it's about the lowest points are sometimes the most fertile ground for God's biggest victories in our lives. And we see this throughout the Old Testament, how many battles of faith were fought in these low points geographically that parallel what you and I experience in life. We have high highs, we have low lows. And unfortunately, and also for our benefit, sometimes in those pits, those deep places, they actually make for great, fertile, watery ground where things can grow. But first, God decides to bring judgment and his power over the people who are not living right. And that leads us to the last one that I came up with. And then if you've got more, I want to talk about them. But the last thing I noticed between Deborah and Moses, that she really is this literary reimagining of him in a different setting. And I think, Micah, that the two of them together are supposed to fast forward us to Jesus, who will also, it's Jesus who's going to face all oppressive rulers. It's Jesus who will be the ultimate judge. It's Jesus who is the living water. I mean, talk about a cosmic water event. He is it. He is the event that both of them are fighting victorious battles, that he had to walk through a valley before he went up to the cross. I've actually walked through that valley myself. And there's going to be heavenly songs sung about Jesus for all of time. And here we have the last thing that they have in common. It's that both of them had songs sung about their victory. So tell us a little bit about those songs.
I think it's worth pointing out too, because you might be tempted to go, well, other people had songs in the Bible. So is that really something that you would pair together? But these are the only two places where the narrative prose and the narrative poem go together. So it's not just that they sang songs, it's that the poem and the story immediately before it go together. And so you're also meant to be like, wait a minute, did we just win a battle and now we're singing about the battle? And so that's exactly what we see happening. Moses' song is it just starts with this massive exaltation of God. It's incredible. And you're just like, man, this slaps. This is such a good song. No wonder Moses writes in the Psalms too. And it's interesting there is in both of these Psalms, and the same thing for Deborah. There's songs about Deborah's courage, Barak's courage, Jael's courage. Humans get also the ability to be celebrated, which is a really beautiful thing that God does and preserves for them. But one of the things that's interesting in both of them is in Moses's song, it talks about the spoil, the Egyptians expect to have spoil, probably the gold they just took from their Egyptian neighbor. But anyway, there's this sense of the Egyptians are already counting their victory spoil. And then you fast forward to Deborah's song and really interestingly, Sisera's mom. So Sisera's the general. His mom is where's my boy? Yep. He should be back dividing his spoil. A damsel or two, right? And so in both of these songs, you see a picture of what the enemy hopes to do. They're not on it's not the Egyptians and the Israelites just disagree on something and now we are having a battle. No. They want bad for the people of God. They want harm for these people, for these very vulnerable people. And you see God spoils their spoil, right? I mean, it's sort of this God exalts it. Also, both songs yes, they exalt the human leaders, but there is no mistaking who wins the battle in both of these. You have this heavenly language. God is looking down in the Moses one, and it says the stars are presiding over the battle in the Deborah one. There are moments in life where you can kind of go back and you look at your has-been moments. You're like, man, I really dominated there, and you forget actually it was all your teammates who scored 87 of the 89 points, but you made the last two, and you're like, yeah, we conquered that. And it's I think the Bible constantly has Ebenezer's. It's hold up, you guys. Yeah, Deborah's great. Barak's great. Jael's great. Jael's really great. I mean, come on.
She's the best.
Yeah. But at no point does the ultimate victory rest with anyone. And you see this even in the Exodus account. Everybody talks, loves to quote, the Lord will be, will fight for you. You need only to be still or to be quiet, sort of this understanding. And you see the credit go to God in those poems, which I think is really beautiful. And then I do want to highlight, man, Sisera's mom, she's the worst. You're really? You get kicked out of the womanhood for this.
The sisterhood is abandoning you.
You get a picture, and it says she's through latticed window, right? She's in wealth, right? They're creating this picture of this woman who lives in extravagance at the hands of oppressing the Israelites, right? At the hand of oppressing people that King Jabin and Sisera have conquered. And she's like, where's my boy? He should be coming back on his chariot any minute now, and he should have his spoil, but his spoil is damsels, right? The victory of warfare is sexual assault and sexual abuse. And the fact that this woman would say, oh, I'm excited for my son and his army. And I'm like, oh, a damsel or two? And then you realize, no. Those two damsels that you thought would be divided up in spoil, they just took your son out by the mighty hand of God. But you should have been more concerned about those damsels than you were. I think that's one of the beautiful things about that poem too, is you get the frivolous vanity of the Canaanite women contrasted with these two really strong women, Deborah and Jael. And I think that's important for young women and young men, for that matter, to understand strength is celebrated in that song. And we see that later in Moses's song. You also have Miriam singing, his sister, and you sort of have these beautiful almost antiphonal song between these men and women together at God's victory as their victory march. It's really incredible.
One of my favorite parts of both stories that they share is that men and women partner together to see the victory through, that both men and women celebrate the victory after it's happened, and that God elevates both of those genders as participants in what he's doing, his ultimate victory. I don't want our listeners to miss that Jesus really fulfills all of this, that all of this is working, as Tim and John would say on the Bible Project, a unified story working towards Jesus. But he also is the one who's fighting battles and overcoming our enemies and going to the lowest points of human depravity and conquering it on our behalf. And the heavens are singing his praises and will continue to do so. Anything else, Nika, that you wanted to point out about Deborah being the second Moses?
It's fascinating when you said earlier, like, I think that's the point, right? Is like, if we ended the topic of like, man, Deborah's awesome, and we don't push forward, because you hear like at the end of Moses' life, hey, a better Moses needs to come, right? A better judge. And in some ways, like, Deborah is that fulfillment, but she's not full fulfillment of that. All these echoes that, y'all go get cat studies. You have all these cosmic water events until you have the Jesus one. You have all the valleys until he walks through, and sort of all these things. As amazing as Moses and Deborah are, we have to keep going. So that's why I say, but I also want to park on Deborah is awesome. And there have been, I want to just encourage the young men and women who want to partner together in ministry and are being told maybe by misguided saints, like, you can't really do that. I would just tell you, like, not only can you, but there are biblical examples all throughout. I read a couple of commentaries that weren't very keen on Deborah. Like, I'm just going to tell you now, if you're a strong woman, chances are, if you're in ministry and you're a strong woman, you will be misunderstood. What gets lost in all of this is when we disparage Deborah, we end up disparaging Barak. And I think instead, if you can see this beautiful partnership between the two of them, you see something really profound and something, frankly, that could be a telos for so many of us in ministry to say, no, this can be done. Like, you can partner together in God's work with men and women. And I think not only can you, I think we're better when we do so. As you're being faithful to the text, as you're being holy and curious, don't be surprised if what you come up with is really strong men and women who are celebrated throughout the scriptures. And I think when you see that, like Ruth and Boaz, when you see the Proverbs 31 woman in all of her strength, when you see these Azers, like, don't be surprised if, like, God is asking you to be strong for him. And I think we need more strong men and women in ministry partnering together to the glory of God. And because we're Deborah's daughters and we're happy to be like her.
I cannot wait to get to the New Testament and to see the good final prophet, the good final judge, right? And the good final cosmic water experience, all wrapped up in Jesus, who's the leader we've all been waiting for. Moses was great. Deborah was great. Jesus is the best. Holy Curiosity is a production of the Center for Women in Leadership, and the producer is Taylor Standridge. Stay curious, y'all.